it's me, tea leaves. Sorry. It's just always having to do the introduction. Hi, it's me. Like you don't know who I am. Okay, so this is part 3 of an excerpt from Do Pirates Dream. And we'll just get into it, because, yeah. Well, we'll get into it when I can find where I was at. 2 hands, smiled, her head tilted. Okay, so, offering the water. He took it one-handed and began drinking while looking at her. She smiled with her head tilted, and her eyes danced. Just as he was about to grab her with his free arm, she swung around on her heel and walked over to grab the broom and dustpan. Then she turned and walked back over to the main mess. She stopped, her eyes crinkled with puzzle as she giggled, and started to wiggle her skirt and her shirt, allowing all the excess cupcake to fall to the floor. She giggled and looked up at him. Would you mind doing the same? Wouldn't want us traipsing cupcake all over the place. She smiled. He said, as he too started to excess cupcake started. He too started excess cupcake fall to the floor. Enough, he asked. She pressed her lips together, closing one of her eyes, and tapped her head a couple times while looking at his head. He was puzzled. He was puzzled and then realized what she meant. Oh, he groaned. She chuckled and stepped forward. Here, I'll get it. She raised her hands like she was holding a basketball and flexed her fingers, motioning for him to lower his head to her. Ha, he chuckled. You want me to bow before you? Ugh, she exclaimed, rolling her eyes. She started to climb the counter to reach his head instead, so that she could reach his head. But he grabbed her and slid her back to the floor. It caught her off guard, and she banged her ankle. Oh, she cried. Or oof. Oof, she cried. He looked at her, but she shook her head, dismissing any concern. He then lowered his head to her, bowing his head to her chest level. She moved closer and reached out her hands to gently loosen all the drying cupcake from his hair. Her fingertips touched his head when his fingers started violently. Oh yeah, okay, better word, right? Started running through his hair and showering her. Oh. Her fingertips had just barely touched his head when he ran his own fingertips violently through his hair, showering her with pieces of cupcake. Ah, she squealed. Why, you crummy. But he cut her off as he looked up at her through his hair. I do believe you're the crummy one, he said, as he stood up, picked a crumb up off her shoulder. Her eyes narrowed at him. She felt like rubbing her bare feet all over his jeans, but then she noticed someone standing in the doorway to the outer garage, and her whole demeanor changed instantly. Oh, hello, she waved. Michael turned around slightly and just looked over his shoulder at one of his crewmen. Justin stammered. Sir, we took care of everything, sir. Michael nodded in acknowledgement, but still stared. Justin blinked a couple times, then kind of pointed toward the warehouse. I'll just be... And he pointed again as he started walking towards the doorway. He stopped and looked at Michael. The dogs, he pointed down. I'm aware, said Michael, still watching him. Oh, said Justin, turning and smiling as he walked into the warehouse. He had never seen Cupcake in the boss's hair before. Michael waited, still watching the door a moment before turning back to her. As soon as they made eye contact, Jen started giggling. Oops. I hope I didn't get you in trouble. Her eyes were smiling. Me? No, he said, with a doubtful expression. He looked down at the floor. Tisking, he said, what a mess you've made, considering you were the one to use most of the cupcake. And he pointed at her, kind of winking. Ah, she began to protest. Then, smiling, shook her own head. 'Tis true. I'll get out of your way, he said, as he leaned against the counter and hopped up. She leaned down and, using the broom, started cleaning underneath things. She had swept and mopped. Well, kind of. She had tied duct tape and a hand towel to the broom. Oh, okay. So most of the mess truly was just cupcake. He watched as she worked. If I may, she said, pausing to look up at him. What's up with, She stopped talking and then mouthed the words, dogs, and pointed in their direction. I'm only asking, she added, putting up her hands defensively before she continued cleaning. He raised his eyebrows at her and chuckled quietly. Oh, you may, he said, a little sarcastically. He wiped his face again with the paper towel he had. But it didn't really help, because it was all dried now, and so was the icing. He didn't have a lot on his face since he had wiped it earlier, but enough was still there that it messed with his handsome features, or hadn't messed with his. I can't tell what that says, sorry. She noticed and rose to her feet and grabbed a few napkins and wet them at the sink. As she got them wet, he spoke. They are really not supposed to be in here. But, somebody invited them in. He finished with a pinched expression, then a normal face. Oh, she raised her hand to her chest with a southern surprise / faint look, and in a Southern Belle accent. My, but who would ever do such horrible thing? She batted her eyes and giggled as she took the dry napkin from him and handed him the wet ones. He chuckled, shaking his head, but accepted them. As he accepted them, he took a couple and wiped his face and neck again. As he rubbed his neck, he stretched his neck and rubbed from one side to the other. And her breath caught in her throat, and she admired him. How warm he had felt, how soft he was. She had been so tempted to leave tiny kisses trailing down his neck, but remembered the no kissing. Oh, bleh. Was this how Richard Gere had felt? Or, well, Edward, his character? I mean, how could he deprive his soft, sweet skin? Her breath caught in her throat again, causing her to to clear it. He looked at her, his eyebrows raised with a what-do-you-want look on his face from her Then he rolled his eyes, grabbing a couple more napkins, and wiped her face. There. Is that what you wanted? Oh, no, she shrugged, shaking her head once, but thank you still. She took one last look before she turned. Poor Richard Gere, she thought, mumbling. What? He asked. Or she said, mumbling. What? He asked. She shook her head. Oh, nothing. I was just mumbling. And then she went back to cleaning. He said, but nothing more. She had most of it in a big pile. She grabbed a garbage bag and started dustpanning it in there. Then she noticed his boots with all its grooves, straps, and buckles that were now caked with cake. Ugh, she sighed. That just won't do. And she shook her head while reaching for some dry napkins and started wiping his boots. Told you I'd fix the grammar as I went along. He looked down and chuckled, saying, but in an industrious, mischievous way. She was working the dried crumbles down to the heel. Her knees were bent, her head low, so that she could focus, but without moving her head, she looked up through the tops of her eyes and blew a stray hair out of her face, then looked back down at her work. He smiled and wiggled his boot that she was working on. She looked at him the way she did a moment before, and then continued her work, but he wiggled his boot again. She looked up at him, raising her head. He shrugged, looking at her, feigning innocence. She continued, and so did he. She looked up again, and he just shook his head. I guess the boots can have a mind of their own. And he shrugged his shoulder, feigning innocence. Ugh, she gasped, and went to her knees, taking a firm grip of the boot. He chuckled and let her have a minute, while he took another sip of his water. Ugh, tap water, he thought. He did not drink tap water. He hated tap water. Slave, he called down to her. Eyes closed, remaining calm, she rose up. Yes, she answered calmly, opening her eyes and smiling sarcastically and sweetly and sarcastically. I'm afraid there is a little cupcake in my cup as well, he said, as well as it's empty. He offered the cup, which she took, although you could hear the plastic cup crinkle as she may have squeezed a little tightly. Yes, sir, she smiled again, sarcastically. She started to turn, but he raised a finger, saying, She turned and tilted her head at him. I believe you used captain the other day, Her eyes narrowed at him. She heaved a big sigh, and then smiling sickly sweet, she said, Yes, of course, Captain. Anything you wish, Captain. She bowed her hands both open and sat out, or whatever, and out, and still holding the cup. He nodded, and she turned toward the sink, her back toward him. He closed his eyes. His body was stirring, and he adjusted his pants. Yes, he thought to himself. He really liked Captain. She came back over, two-hand offering, but also bending at the waist and bowing her head. He took it from her, smiling. Oh, sometimes she was just too much. But he found himself enjoying it. She started to stand up and turn to grab some more napkins again, but he raised a finger. Hold on, there's a line through some of this. I'm not really sure why. And began drinking. But he raised a finger as if he had something to say, as he said, and then began drinking, still holding up his finger, while staring at her. With each slow gulp, her eyes narrowed at him. As she waited for his next command, he finished and then licked some of the rim of the empty cup. He looked at her quizzically. Did you need something? He asked. Again, she narrowed her eyes. And then you held up your finger, saying which seems to be your way of telling me to wait for your next command. Your next command. He looked at her with a sad, compassionate look. I think you must have misunderstood. My pointed finger meant number 1, and I said yum, not I remember that part. Sadly shaking his head, and then he smiled at her, as in, this is number 1 tap water, and yum. She shook her head slowly and appeared to remain calm, smiling, even though the muscles around her mouth twitched and her eyes were flashing. He imagined if his eyes could do anything like hers, they would be dancing like jesters, spinning and twirling before the king. He tilted his head and smiled at her. Hers narrowed but still flashed, and suddenly she advanced on him, growling and grabbing the wet napkins. What? What's that word? I can't read my own writing sometimes. I have to wake up in the middle of the night and write. Grabbing the wet napkin, swung around something. Oh, crashing. Oh, that works. Crashing against his legs and forcing them apart with her in the middle. Her back to him leaning against the counter. She grabbed his leg. Oh, that's right. Okay. Her back to him as she leaned against the counter against him. She grabbed his legs under each one of her arms. He scooted back so that she could easily hold one of his boots, and she started cleaning the straps and buckles again. Whoa, he thought. She took him by surprise. She growled and attacked. He chuckled. So she was strong. He chuckled again. But so was he. He leaned back, his hands palm down on the counter. He chuckled out loud. This time she heard it. She turned her head slightly to the side as if she was listening for something, and then she went back to cleaning. Intermittently, he wiggled his legs, barely using any strength, but apparently strong enough that she had to squeeze his legs with her arm just to keep a hold. He chuckled as he started shaking his legs again. It was comical to see her trying to hold him. Sometimes he cursed his unnatural strength, especially with all its side effects, but occasionally, rarely actually, he was glad to have it. And because this was quite comical, and she looked like she was about to crawl up his leg, or maybe she was just trying to sit on his leg to hold him down. Well, the arm. I don't know. Anyway. He thought, silly little girl, and securing his legs under her arms, squeezing her sides, he lifted her up. It took her a minute, but then she gasped as she realized her feet weren't actually touching the floor anymore. Michael, she called out angrily, kicking her feet against the cabinet. That just made him laugh out loud. Yes, he was glad for the strength. She wasn't lightweight or little, but most guys would not be able to do this. But for him, it was like picking up a rag doll. Michael, she called out again, growling a little. She was beating her hands against his boots and growling. Out of the corner of his eyes, he could see some figures run past from the outer garage to the warehouse, their hands shielding their faces as they ran past. Pausing only to say, "Done, sir, but you should look at your phone soon." Never looking, and then following others ran also through. Ben and Isaac walked through, no face shield, as they stopped in the doorway and stared. Michael looked over at Ben, shrugged his shoulders and eyebrows. She couldn't see them because they were behind her line of vision, and because she was turned a little away from them as she wiggled to get above his legs. So instead of his legs under her arms, he would be holding her closer to her waist. She struggled up to get to her waist, whatever. "Everything okay?" he asked them. They started to answer, but she beat them to it. No, it most certainly is not." Michael was still looking at them, but he couldn't help a little smile as he glanced at her and back at them. Ben was older, so he rolled his eyes, but Isaac was a young fellow himself, and he was grinning. He mouthed, "Yeah, it's good," and then to Michael, and then gestured at Michael's phone. Michael nodded. Then as Ben walked on through to the warehouse, Isaac chuckled, and pointing at her, gave him the thumbs up. Then he followed Ben into the warehouse. Michael watched him leave, then looked back at her. "My, but you sure are a feisty little captive." When he had spoke the first time, it was only 2 words, so not much to go on, but this time it was a sentence. She tilted her head to the side, listening when he spoke. She figured by now he would be exhausted from holding her up. She had struggled to help make him tired. She had struggled a lot so that it would make him tired, and then she could slip right through. I mean, come on, he couldn't hold her forever. But after hearing his voice, his calm, relaxed voice, it didn't sound tired, breathless, or spent. It was awake, strong, and clear, with, she had heard it, laughter. His voice was, like he could do this for hours. He wasn't tired at all. "No," she spoke calmly, "you're not tired or worn out." And from behind her, all she could hear was a chuckle that turned into a sinister, quiet laugh. The kind that was like a scary clown hiding in the dark corner of the funhouse. The one with the unsettling laugh. Yeah, like that one. And it unsettled her now, making her cringe a little, but strangely also a little tingly. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up as she sensed something. She gasped as somehow he whispered softly in her ear, "No." Then from further back, he said, "I could hold you like this forever." She could hear his smile. No, she thought, surely not forever. Could he? Who was this guy? He certainly wasn't your typical druggy crime lord, or maybe he was, but also a chemist, and had snorted some of his own experimental blend, and it had given him surprise super strength in his legs or something. But surely not forever. Okay, time to go, she thought. She had not realized it at first, but when he had whispered in her ear, he had also shifted his leg, bringing her slightly closer. As he shifted back, his legs were not under her arms now. They were closer to her waist. "Oh, well, we'll see about that," she challenged, and then began growling and thrashing again. He squeezed his legs tighter, but again now he had her waist, not her arms. Oh, so now her arms could move more freely now. "You kind of sound like a cat," he said. Again, no exhaustion in his voice, like he was talking about the weather. It might rain, it might not. She said suddenly, and purred. Cats have claws. Cats scratch and have cats have claws and they scratch. While still thrashing, her arms backwards onto his legs, kind of where she assumed the tops of his legs' groin area would be, and landed in what she hoped would be a good spot, and she kitty-cat dug her claws in. It must have worked, because along with a very surprisingly painful and also interesting groan from behind her, his hips jerked and his legs spasmed, but also went weak. Just weak enough that she could push his boots away and slide down to the floor, free of his prison. Once she was on the floor, she spun around on all fours and backed up, taking a stance like a cross between an animal and a spider. She held calmly, watching him and waiting. It would have taken him longer to recover, except he sat up almost immediately because he thought he had dropped her. Well, if he had, she had recovered quickly and was all on her own. He was still feeling tender from where the strength and pressure of her fingers had somehow, through his jeans, sunk into his flesh. It had been a mixture of pleasure and pain. Some fingers... Definitely a surprise, whether she planned it or not. The mixture of the three had been what she needed to distract him and escape. He chuckled, "Clever girl," and sat up, watching her scramble away from him. But she did it like an animal. Her shoulders flexed, her back arched, and she kneeled forward while she leaned back on her arms. She was looking at him from the tops of her eyes, with her head tilted down and to the side. Her eyes looked cautious and wary. He was sitting up, his arm on his leg, head resting on his chin. He was still in a little bit of pain, but it would just be a reminder for later. Do not underestimate her. Like she said, "I'm stronger than I look." Indeed, yes, you are, he thought to himself as he stared back at her with his amused expression. She continued to stare, then blinking a couple times, she rose up, saying, "Nobody puts baby in the corner." Then she shook her head and chuckled a little as she came near him. "Can we call a truce? Or at least a temporary ceasefire, please? I really should get this finished," she said, gesturing around them to the mess. He closed his eyes, and with a slight nod. So she nodded with a smile, then looking down, grabbed his boot and started pulling it off, which was not an easy task because he was moving his foot inside the boot. Oh, we're at 20. Gosh, sorry. Okay, we'll just keep going because apparently it didn't switch to another thing anyway. Yeah, for a couple minutes. Anyway, did Okay, fully aware of their ceasefire, but it was still just too amusing not to play, especially when she doesn't know someone is messing with her. She tugged and yanked while he easily slid the other boot off and it landed on the floor. Then she bent in half, yanking with her feet in front of her. Even moving his feet didn't stop her from finally yanking it off. He tried to jump up to stop her from hitting the floor and the cabinets, but instead down she tumbled to the floor. He couldn't stop that, but he did stop her from hitting her head as he slid his hand on the cabinet as soon as she hit it. Oh, okay, as soon as she hit against the cabinet. He leaned down, looking at her. "Are you all right?" he asked with some concern. She scrunched her eyes and shook her head a couple times before smiling triumphantly, holding up the boot, saying, "Ha! I got it." He had to laugh as he helped her to her feet. "You sure did," he agreed with her. He stood watching her made up the 2 boots before placing them in a plastic bag. He raised his eyebrows at her. "I'm beat," she said with a smile. "I shall no longer fight the kick of these boots. At least not tonight." "Ha!" he agreed. "Agreed," he said, laughing at her, using his own line against him. Did he? And she placed the bag on the counter and then grabbed the broom, started sweeping, and swept up to the counter. She used a napkin to wipe the fallen crumbs from when he had leaned back, and some had fallen from his hair. Oh, okay, hold on. Can't read some of this, sorry. Like I said, right in the middle of the night. Slipped it all up and then stood back admiring her work. Then she noticed little marks, chocolatey marks. She looked at his feet with black socks, but no evidence of chocolate on or around him. Then she looked down at her own. "Oh, bother," she said to no one in particular. She grabbed the broom and leaned it against the counter where the sink was. "An alley-oop," she said as she was back sitting up on the counter again. She swung her legs up around and put her feet in the sink. He wasn't paying any attention. In fact, he was looking at his phone. Okay, so I'm going to cut there because now we're going to do, I guess, part 4. But it'll be done after that, so you'll be okay.